Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Jill Manthorpe from King's College London, and I work on a study called Evidem, and the particular part of the study I'm going to be talking about is the work on the Mental Capacity Act and its relation with adult safeguarding. Kathy, the people who commissioned this research were something very grand called the National Institute of Health Research, NIHR, and we're part of a larger study working around the subject of dementia that goes from early diagnosis to end-of-life care. But the work on Mental Capacity Act is a very interesting area to research because it crosses everything. It crosses before diagnoses of dementia, people perhaps make plans, but also end-of-life decisions about whether or not people want to continue with treatment and how they want care in their last days. I think I've been interested in this area for about 25 years when I worked on a study called the Law and Vulnerable Elderly People, and you can tell by that how long the study was ago. But to me the Mental Capacity Act is really interesting because it crystallises interest in adult safeguarding, in dementia, risk, and above all it's about practice with people and about very close practice that particularly social workers engage in, about people making decisions, planning ahead sometimes, but also responding to distress and crisis. Well, our key findings are emerging. I suppose one of the key points that we've picked up on is that when you have a new piece of legislation, and this isn't just related to Mental Capacity Act, there is a great flurry of interest and everybody does a lot of training, and then in somewhere like social care where turnover is massive, by about 5 years on, which is where we are now, a lot of this training has been forgotten. So we are finding really that the Mental Capacity Act, like other forms of training, needs to be embedded within organisations, needs to be refreshed, and people need opportunities such as supervision to talk about the dilemmas and the ethical issues that are arising before it. And at the other extreme, I suppose we're quite interested to say what's happening around the offences of ill treatment and willful neglect under the Act, and the way perhaps that the law is being used to very good effect by saying that some forms of behaviour with vulnerable adults are simply so bad, they're not just poor practice, they're actually illegal. And I think we've seen stories in the press which have confirmed to people that there are standards that vulnerable people are entitled to. It's a matter of human rights, and that people who willfully neglect or ill-treat people can't get away with it anymore. Difficult to make a general point about specific issues, and I suppose that issue comes up in adult safeguarding a lot, isn't it? And it's really quite useful to take more of a forensic look and say, at what point do you think there are difficulties? And you know, the old idea about looking at barriers and facilitators, and indeed is prosecution the actual end of it all for people as well. So I think that we have said for a long time in adult safeguarding, oh, people aren't acting together, people, you know, it's always difficult to get prosecutions even if it's theft or something like that, or other things. What particularly are the barriers, and how can we address each and every one of those barriers? So if it is something around evidence, you know, how really well trained are people in collecting evidence? If it's something around people being able to perhaps provide contextual details, or actually saying it is worthwhile going to court, how can we persuade people that actually it is worthwhile going to court? I don't think anybody comes into the business and says, let's not prosecute anybody, but there are perhaps a series of barriers, and obviously there are a series of facilitators, and we need to see what they are. But of course, you know, a conviction is not the end of everything, it's only the beginning of the end, and you've still got to pick up the pieces, deal with the system's problems, and so something like a conviction is one marker of this, a very important marker, but it's not inevitably the only outcome that people want. So rather than get hung up on the number of convictions, and we demand more and more convictions, it's really saying, are these being used proportionately and to good effect, and what's the effect on the cautionary way we need to use them in the media about not scaring relatives that any time they go into a care service or a health service, people are going to be abused and mistreated, because clearly they're not. Yes, I think dementia is always a litmus test in any research, because people don't usually have dementia, they have a range of other conditions as well, and people find the ethical issues around dementia very, very worrying. And I suppose this Act and also the proposals of the Law Commission, which are going to come out, will be ways in which we begin as a society to think, what do we do with larger and larger numbers of people with dementia, cognitive impairment, mild cognitive impairment. And, as you know, if you work with practitioners, they're usually hugely engaged with this because of their own parents and adult members, and of course it's something that should be facing ourselves perhaps. Oh, we've got a sack full of data and I'm really grateful to everybody who's participated. It's so helpful to have people who want to tell you about their job and what they do. It's very humbling, isn't it, to go and talk to care assistants and find that actually they don't get any supervision, and this is the first time that you're dealing with people, you're giving them the opportunity to talk. So we're really grateful to them. We've got lots of professional data, what they do, how they make decisions, perhaps the increasing number of people who've been thinking about, I want this when I die, I want this when I go in a home, so on and so forth. We've got data from what we call well older people, but also we've been able to have the privilege of going into people's own homes and talk with them a long period of time about day-to-day decisions. A lot of this is talked about in, shall we flick the switch off and shall we not feed anybody anymore? But actually, I'm always one for saying, the real ethical decisions about what do you do when something is rotting in the fridge and your mum or somebody says, don't throw that away to the healthcare assistant. Do you do that? And how do you manage all those everyday dilemmas? And I think the Act provides a very good framework for that, but it also draws some boundaries. So we've got lots of data, we've been synthesising those, we've tried to pick up also the conviction data, the ones where there have been prosecutions, to try and listen about what are the common themes that are there. And that's a big old safeguarding debate, isn't it? Are they bad apples, individuals who shouldn't be allowed to do anything with anybody, or is it bad barrels? The whole system is at fault. And of course today is when the Winterbourne View inquiry or serious case review has come out, so I'll be reading that with great interest before talking on the hot seat, to try and think about how the system there worked, as well as the bad barrel, bad apples, and the things that have come through, and that we should learn in dementia services as well as learning disability services, because clearly they're very, very interconnected. Interestingly enough, I think social workers have been have done very well from things like the Mental Capacity Act, because actually they have a lot more legal training on their courses, not just training but familiarity with the law and its processes, and they're often the source of advice at local level, and that's very good for them. As well as safeguarding, they can help people think through good practice in other ways, and they don't just have to be in charge of abuse or anything. So social workers particularly have been very helpful, I think, to local agencies. We've also talked about avoiding people getting the information on the information merry-go-round, in which they're given advice to go to different voluntary organisations, none of whom are really too certain about things. And so we say, map out what's going on in your local area, know who the sources of advice. And then we say that probably the best way of giving confidence to service users and carers is being familiar with things that look like big forms, to be able to say, this is what other people in your situation have done, and that's good professional practice. And if you don't know about something, knowing the person who will give you the information. So those are some of the messages that I think at practice level we've been trying to distill, which pretty common sense anyway. The implications are going to be around two areas. One about changing the law anyway. What is it when the new law comes out on adult social care? How can we embed that into practice so that people don't just have this flurry of information and then that's it, because turnover will still continue to be there. What makes for an adult learning approach, I did interview somebody who talked how they'd had to learn to chant various parts of the Code of Practice of the Mental Capacity Act. I don't know whether really that was an adult learning event, but it seemed to me that adult learning approaches are very common in social work, but they're not always there. And what people like to do is think about problems and real case examples, and to think and talk about them as adults rather than to swallow textbooks. So that's a lesson for the new legislation. The second one is that there will always be some interfaces. One of the most commonly talked about is Mental Capacity Act, Mental Health Act, but clearly Mental Capacity Act will interface with carers' rights, with human rights legislation, and the other panoply of legislation that's around, particularly the new legislation that's on board. So we'll be looking toward about the proposals for the new legislation and thinking about what can we learn about implementation and what can we learn about interface. I think for people who are unfamiliar with it, the Code of Practice is a real classic, and it wasn't a surprise it won awards for plain English. And if it wins awards for plain English, then clearly it's probably going to be useful for practitioners, unlike a lot of things. So I suppose if you're not really familiar with Mental Capacity Act, that's great. If you want to read around more other areas, I think it's really Horses for Courses. If you're interested in safeguarding, then there are a number of articles in the Journal of Adult Protection. If you're interested in the dementia angle, then the Journal of Dementia Care frequently features some aspects of that. And then if you've got really a long time on the beach over summer, there's a series of reports that have come through around DOLS, the deprivation of liberty safeguards, and indeed the best interest decision-making research published a couple of months ago. And that too raises some really important issues about how do you work out what's in somebody's best interest. Easy to say, hard to do.